I'm John McLennan. I chair TSDAC and represent the Virginia Association of Counties. I'm the chairman of the James City County Board of Supervisors.
So Kate Mattice with the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, representing Virginia Transit Association.
Sam Sink with DRTC in Richmond. I represent the Virginia Transit Association as well.
I'm Brian Dude, the Director of Transit at Blacksburg Transit, and I'm representing TSDAC.
Jennifer DeBrule, I'm the Acting Director of DRPT.
And Grant Sparks, I'm the Acting Chief of Public Transportation for DRPT.
Okay. Any staff members we should make pointers?
Yeah, I think one that I'd like to introduce to the group, Daniel Wagner is here. He will be taking notes today. Daniel is a statewide transit planner with us. So thanks for your help today, Daniel.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Yes. We have a number of items to consider today. We have two that we hope we'll be able to get through fairly quickly. A discussion of proposed changes to the merit capital policy and a discussion of proposed changes to transit strategic plan guidelines. And what we'd like to do with this is to see if everybody's more or less satisfied with it, kind of put a stamp on it and take a vote to approve. Each of you have received the materials, and I guess, Dan, did you want to take us through anything about these items?
The materials that were passed out?
Yes, the materials that, yes, we received last week.
And I can actually step in, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
So today's going to be a little bit different than the previous meetings. We only have one presentation, and so it'll be the presentation on some scenarios that we've run for the operating formula. But before we get into that presentation, as Mr. Chair was saying, we have a couple red line policy changes that we sent out last week to the group. And so we don't have any slides. And actually, Mary Olivia, if you could advance slides, please. We just wanted to do a quick discussion and wrap up on these items to make sure that there were no lingering concerns or questions on the merit capital policy, as well as the transit strategic plan guidelines. So we were just hoping to open it up and take any final feedback from the group.
Great. Okay. I should also have mentioned that Dr. Smoot is representing the Commonwealth Transportation Board on TSDAC.
Correct. He's in one of the DRPT appointed.
Right. So, does anybody have any comments on the first item, the proposed changes to the merit capital policy?
Right. One small one, it's not the redlined one, but it's the first whereas. It's for projects, capital projects. I think there's one too many projects in there.
That's probably my mistake for 2018.
That's on page one?
It's on page one. It's the first whereas. I think projects is in there one too many times.
Thank you.
Right.
And Mr. Chair, comment not actually on the draft, because I don't really have any concern fixing, obviously, as everybody will, fixing the typos and things like that. I think it's important for us to have an ongoing conversation about sort of how DRPT would approach a bucket of funding that localities can use to match federal, and sort of what that looks like in the budget process. I think some of us are trying to envision how that gets lined up, timing and all that kind of stuff. So it's less about policy and a little bit more about the procedures moving forward. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that to share now, or we can just know that there's a commitment to understanding the timing and how that can work.
So, Kate, what I'm envisioning is something that you're very familiar with in Northern Virginia, and that when we've had the WMATA, like the blue-yellow shutdown, the orange line shutdown for the platform improvement programs, we didn't know what we wanted to fund necessarily, but we set aside, we put a line in the 6-year program with funding for that purpose. And so what I envision is we would do the same thing and have a line in the program that would be, matching funds to support federal discretionary awards. And we would, much like we did with the funds that were set aside for those platform improvement programs, the projects, the mitigation, we would have a process through mid-cycle to support federal awards as they're made. Those projects are still going to have to go, that was done through the demonstration program. This being as part of the capital program, those projects would still have to go through, the criteria and the evaluation for prioritization. But honestly, we would know that those projects score well before we would ever support the federal discretionary award. So to me, it's just having that funding, a line item in the 6-year program, and then being able to use the mid-cycle process to award funding and take those awards back to the CTV for their policy.
And I guess just to further that, I think probably is working very closely on the scheduling, so that you guys, what I'm hearing is the earlier that our locality inform you of their interest in applying for those federal grants, the easier all of this process will be.
Right, and I think this year, and Grant can speak to this better than I can, but we just, got through 2 NOFOs that were due at the end of May. We've seen more federal discretionary applications out of the Commonwealth of Virginia for those programs than we've ever seen before. So this is what we wanted to see happen. It's what we've talked about at TSDAC. So, and we worked closely with all those agencies, and in fact, the RPT applied for bus and bus facilities for the first time ever on behalf of a handful of agencies, taking on, like we discussed, that administrative burden of working through that process with FTA. So, I think we have, before we've had the money set aside, we've already kind of prepped that process to get, to partner on those applications, to get letters signed by the Secretary to support those applications. I feel like we're very well positioned. We've submitted those applications. We know we'll hear something in the middle of August. We're already looking towards next year using our capital needs assessment to identify target projects that we want to reach out to the transit agencies proactively and say, these are the kind of projects we think will do well in those programs, and what can we do to help you now to apply. So if we do that, and we're talking very early and not waiting for a notice of funding opportunity to drop, we should be well positioned to know how much money would be needed to provide, a funding commitment from the Commonwealth to support those projects. And it's equally important to be able to continue to articulate that by doing that, we're actually saving the Commonwealth a considerable amount of transit capital funding.
Any other comments or questions? Let me give the opportunity to mention Jamie Jackson has joined us. Would you mind introducing yourself, Jamie, to our vast viewing audience?
Good morning, Jamie Jackson. I am the Director of Public and Transportation for Fredericksburg Regional Transit, City of Fredericksburg, and the DRPT rep on the staff.
Thank you. And Jim Dyke is here as well?
Yes, it's Jim Dyke from Northern Virginia, former member of the Commonwealth Transportation Board, former member of the Metro Board, former Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and longtime student Jennifer. So happy and glad to be here.
Always willing to be recruited.
Glad to have you here, too. We were just moving along to take formal action on the merit capital policy and proposed changes to the strategic plan guidelines, so that we can kind of put a final stamp on those.
Okay.
Move on.
Very good.
Any questions about this?
Chair?
Yes.
Chair,
Cindy?
this is Cindy. I just wanted to acknowledge I joined the meeting at the beginning of this discussion, and so I just wanted to acknowledge because I had a little trouble getting in, so wasn't there at the beginning. But good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Cindy. Great. So then let me just ask, any more discussion of the merit capital policy? If not, do I have a motion to approve, to recommend this policy?
So moved.
Second?
Okay, any discussion? All in favor, please signify by the sign of aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. And so we will, any abstentions? Okay. All right, and so now let's move on to the transit strategic plan guidelines. Any questions about those items before we move them forward?
I just had one clarification. It's on page 4. In the chart, under the annual update, it says completed service asset and financial worksheet. But on the previous page, it says updated. So I'm just trying to keep the text consistent.
Thank you for pointing that out. We'll make sure to make that more consistent with the language. Thank you.
All right. Any other comments or questions? If not, do I have a motion to recommend these guidelines? Motion. Right. Second. Okay. All in favor, please signify by the sign of aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions? Great. All right. I think we can then pass these, and we now can in our discussion of the transit operating system scenarios. And Dan, I guess you're going to just.
I think that's me. So first of all, can everybody on the phone hear me okay? I think we can switch. But can, I mean, we can do whatever.
Want to sit here?
No, I don't need to sit in the front. I think this is fun. I just want to make sure that Cindy and Dr. Smoot on the phone can hear me.
I'm hearing you clear.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is fine over here,
Okay.
unless you all want to switch things around. But I guess I just wanted to start by thanking you all for the great discussion last month. It was very helpful in kind of laying out where we wanted to go with this kind of deeper dive into scenarios for the operating formula. So staff, after the last meeting, took the feedback from TSDAC, and we developed a series of 8 additional scenarios that are outlined in the presentation that we distributed, but also in the very large operating formula scenario comparison sheet. Now, this has the summary of all of those, and I just, again, like last time, just be careful with the rustling of papers near the microphones. But this outlines all of the results of the 9 scenarios total, which includes the one that we ran last time, the FY24 projected, and all of the 8 additional ones on there. So if you wanted to look at them across the board, you can look at it on that one sheet. So I will also start by saying that, as advised by TSDAC, we did not break open the formula. We instead we did some sensitivity testing surrounding 3 large areas. You can go to the next slide, please. This slide here outlines everything that's within this presentation today, including a review of the baseline, which is the FY21 allocation and why we chose that. The scenario 1, which is the projected FY24 allocations with no changes, and then these 3 groupings of scenarios. The first grouping is commuter rail modifications, where we look at changing the sizing metrics to the commuter rail pool to step up the process. The second is the operating funding cap modifications, where we look at what happens when we change the cap around. And the third is operating funding floor scenarios, where we look at what happens when we add a funding floor to the formula to see how that kind of pans out. So to start, I'll just review why we're going with the FY21 allocation as our baseline. This was included last time, so this will look familiar, but it's just a review. There were multiple reasons why we chose FY21 as our baseline. First, it represents the only time that the formula was run as intended without any additional state funding coming into agencies for operating purposes. It also includes pre-pandemic metrics for sizing and performance, which helps to illustrate the impact of the recent trends on the operating allocation. Third, it includes the allocation of funding that's somewhat comparable to what's projected for FY24. In FY21, we had $102 million, more or less, and in FY24, we are projected to have around $114 million. So it's about a 14% increase. In more recent years, available funds, of course, were much higher than that, and so we didn't want to use those more recent years as the baseline for comparison. Next slide. So the next 2 slides just illustrate the FY21 actual allocation that happened in that year. A few things I just wanted to point out on this slide is that all scenarios going forward will be compared to the orange line that you'll see on this graph and the next. Also, I wanted to just point out the scaling on the y-axis. For the upper 2 quartiles, it's way higher than the lower 2 quartiles. So this you'll see it up to 25 million. On some of the other ones where we illustrate the 30% cap, we actually have to 35 million. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the scaling comes way down. It's all under 700 million. 700,000. Excuse me. None of our small agencies are receiving that much money. So that's all I wanted to point out with these 2, just to get everybody used to seeing these colors and graphs. Next slide. So again, I presented on this last month, but to summarize what we did for the scenario 1, FY24 projected, scenario. This included no changes to the formula, but it included the data that's outlined here, and I just wanted to review some of the constraints to that data that we're facing. So we have to rely, first of all, on audited costs from FY21 in this scenario and the scenarios moving forward, because we are currently still in FY22, and we will not have audited financials until the fall of this year. And so because projected budgets are often different than audited expenses, we chose to go with the last audited year. In addition, the ridership, revenue hours, and revenue miles data that's included in here does represent the actual data that will be used in next year's allocation. So it comes from FY19 through 22. There is a note here that in FY22, we did have to project out the last 3 years last 3 months of the year, because we are still in FY22, and all of this baselining was run about a month ago. So we didn't have April, May, or June data. So we projected it out based on historic trends and trends that we're seeing this year. In addition, PMT for the commuter rail sizing step is for FY22, but it was synthesized here for all agencies, since nobody has reported this data yet, because we're still, again, in FY22. Next slide. So these next two slides illustrate the projected FY24 allocation for the upper two quartiles and then the lower two quartiles. Again, this is with no change to the formula. This is what we can expect to see next year. The blue bars here, and this is consistent going forward, illustrate the projected allocation under the scenario. The orange line illustrates the FY21 actual allocation. The red dashes are the 30% cap line for each agency. And the percentage that's summarized across the bottom is the change compared to FY21. There's a lot of different things you can compare in here, but I just wanted to be very clear about that. Where, where the HRC 8%, it means it is an 8% increase over that FY21 level. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to be comparing to both FY21, because that's our baseline, but also what we're kind of seeing here as what the future would look like without any changes. So please, as I said last time, stop me, ask for clarifying questions. This stuff gets very complicated.
Dan, can I chime in here for a second? One of the things that I think, as we looked at the different analysis, one thing that became apparent, and we're dealing with a COVID, hopefully post-COVID environment, is that the formula in terms of looking at performance, which is what the code tells us to do, is working as it was designed. So the folks that have seen, like VRE, that have seen like devastating impacts to their ridership because of COVID have dropped. So I mean, the formula itself, which we've only been able to use 1 year, is working as it was designed. And I think I would like to kind of put a little context around today's discussion and say, what, and I'm not, this is more of a rhetorical question, but something to think about as we go through today is, is there an issue with the formula, or is the issue how do we unravel ourselves from the impacts of COVID, which have been uneven across Virginia's transit agencies? Because there's two different paths we can go on with that. And this isn't pretty for some of our agencies. And Dan will walk you through that with Cindy's favorite scatter plots. And but everything that's on there that's negative or positive has a very specific reason and justification for it. And so I want to caution everybody, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and let's figure out what is the problem we're trying to solve as we walk through these slides, and not get wrapped up so much in moving things for the sake of moving things.
Thank you for that. And so just to summarize a couple of the high-level takeaways from this. Under the scenario, in the upper two quartiles, there are 5 agencies that hit their 30% cap. That includes GRTC, Blacksburg, Harrisonburg, Valley Metro, and WADA. And we're going to be looking at those throughout, because we can kind of see how the formulas under different scenarios impact that, the ability to reach that cap. All agencies that are above that orange line, so where the blue bars are above the orange line, they're expecting projected increases compared to FY21, and those below projected decreases. And so the projected decreases on this upper two quartile charts include VRE, Loudoun County, and GLTC. Go to the next slide, please. Here, of course, we have the lower two quartiles. Again, any of the light blue bars that are above the orange line project an increase compared to FY21. Those below the line, a decrease. And in this chart, also, multiple agencies are hitting their 30% cap. Mountain Empire, Star, Farmville, Blackstone, Bluefield, Lake Area, and the town of Elmwood. So there's a number of these smaller agencies that hit the 30% cap.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Maybe irrelevant, but with respect to Loudoun, the fact that they're going to be opening up the Silver Line hopefully by the end of this year, does that have any impact at all on, for example, providing alternative opportunities for folks? How does that impact them since they're below the cap?
So it's a good question. And so the Silver Line opening and all the additional ridership on Metro that would result in that would not impact Loudoun County.
I could, just because I've had some conversations recently with Loudoun County, specifically the concern is these are looking back at ridership. They're projecting a completely new route structure.
Yeah.
And so, again, I think it really, look, Acting Director, you've got the point exactly right. Is it the methodology, or is it how long, when it comes to the rebound and the new transit world, some are getting there faster than others. Loudoun County in particular, and I don't know if they're going to be providing public comment today.
Penny has already messaged me that she would like to correct.
Is that they are absolutely recognizing, they've got next year, they're going to be running more service. But if you look to last year, it was a different type of service that was affected. So I think that, they are absolutely watching this. We may be hearing a little bit more from them. Obviously, we're watching it as well. I think it's also fair to say, just if I could, nearly the same thing is seeing the characteristics of the rebound are different in different markets and in different types of transit, and we're in the weird spot of time, right? But so I absolutely appreciate your comment, because that is exactly what we heard from our colleagues up in Loudoun County. They are planning to do a whole bunch of new service to get people on the Silver Line next year.
Right, exactly.
So glad I was not coming out of left.
No, this is fantastic. I did not plan this.
And I think the hard question to answer is, how long does it take for that to kind of cycle through? And I will say, one of the things that I hear a lot speaking with the Secretary and others is, how proactive can we be? And this is Loudoun's a great example, to make adjustments to transition our services to what the commuting environment looks like now. Bob Schneider does a great job of talking about how you take a commuter service that used to be bookended on a traditional peak period, and you start spreading it out across the day and start changing your service profile to meet what the working environment, what the commuting environment looks like now. And I think the more nimble we are as an industry to react and put those things in place, the better we're going to be. But yes, we have a formula that looks in the rearview mirror, and we're all looking ahead, and we need to be able to articulate what we're doing to look ahead. And so how do we get through the next couple of years? And so that's why, we've got a lot of scenarios today that are going to talk through certain elements of the formula that TSDAC brought up last time. But I would just, again, I think we're all in the same place. It's we really haven't done this a whole lot. It shows that it does what it's supposed to do. We're just in this weird COVID space, and how do we get ourselves?
And if I could, the bus systems have a lot more flexibility to be nimble.
Absolutely.
The VRE do not. They have slots.
And they can have more.
And they have more slots. But anyway,
Yeah.
so I appreciate the conversation, because this is exactly what our folks are all grappling with.
And hearing what Jennifer said, it reminded me of a phrase I've used a couple of times in the education arena, and that is, we're doing sort of an intellectual moonwalk. We're looking forward, but walking backwards. So keep that in mind.
Great, thank you for the question. You can go to the next one. So this scatter plot is what we're going to do with the underdraw scenarios. It shows the x-axis, the amount change that we're projecting, and that changes between FY21 and whatever the projected scenario is showing us, and the percent change is going on the y-axis. So here you get a better sense of kind of the scale of those projected changes and how they kind of look next to each other. The outliers on the positive side are GRTC, is Fairfax County, Petersburg Transit. On the left-hand side is VRE, Loudoun County, GLTC that are at the negative column. But notably here, most agencies are projected to receive increased allocations compared to FY21. Simply the dollar amount isn't that much because a lot of those are smaller agencies. That's kind of why they're hugging the y-axis. Next slide. So a few high-level takeaways from the FY24 scenario 1. We're projecting an increase of $14 million in total operating funds available next year, but clearly allocations are not projected to increase for everybody. There's 6 agencies with those projected decreases. That includes VRE, Loudoun County, GLTC, Radar, Farm Bill, and Pony Express. And we'll note here that NEOC is also projected to go down, but just by 1%, and so they're pretty much the same. And so I've left them off of this for now. Those projected decreases, but also the increases, are all a function of the metrics that are used in the formula, which includes operating costs for all agencies except for VRE, ridership, revenue hours, revenue miles, and of course those performance trends. Interestingly, all agencies with a projected funding decrease between FY21 and 24 had a reduction in operating expenses over that time for various reasons that I'll explain momentarily. And those operating expenses were between 19 and 21 because that's what we always look back at 2 years. Except for VRE. VRE's budget actually went up slightly by about 5%, but their allocation comes down significantly. This is illustrated on the next 2 slides in a moment, but one thing that I wanted to note here is that in the existing formula, operating cost serves as a bit of a stabilizing factor for a lot of agencies. These costs tend to stay the same or consistent year to year compared to other kinds of performance metrics that you may see. So that provides some consistency to a lot of agencies. And when these costs do change, a change in the state allocation is justified because if audited expenses go down, it makes sense for that to be reflected in the next year's allocation. Now, that doesn't get to the point that Kate just mentioned about looking forward, but it's the way that the formula is currently designed.
I do have a question actually passed along. I'm passing along a question from Brian Smith at HRT. And so will the increased cost being subsidized by the state for system-wide fare-free implementation be justified to include as part of the operating costs for using for the system side? Like, is there and I don't know a lot about this space, so I'm just reading what he's asking.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So will increased costs being subsidized by the state for system-wide fare-free implementation be justified to include as part of the operating costs used for the system sizing calculation? And I think my sense is that by offering fare-free, the system costs are going up, and are they? Inferring that he's suggesting are they going to be penalized in some ways because they've elected to take that program. I don't know if that's what he's getting at. Hopefully, perhaps he can get back to me with a little bit more.
There's 2 calculations for operating costs. One does remove operating costs that are funded through grants by DRPT from the formula, but we don't have finance with us today. Okay. It's the sizing one. Thank you.
Sizing one subtracts out the funding coming in from other programs in DRPT. Okay. But for the performance, operating for performance, it takes into account the whole.
Right. Oh, okay. So the answer is no, it's not a part of the sizing, which is what he's asking. So.
Yeah, it gets pulled out of the sizing.
Thank you for that.
I knew it was one of the other things.
Okay, next slide, please. So these next, somebody on the.
Dr. Smith, did you have a question?
Yeah, Jennifer, and give me the quick and high level view. Let's take Lynchburg as an example, and I'm taking that because the person who sits next to me around the table at CTB is from Lynchburg, and he's likely to see this and ask me. So what accounts for the fairly significant reduction at Lynchburg? Is it ridership? Is it operating cost reductions in the previous year or two, or what?
So you talked about sitting next to Mr. Dodson at the CTB. I'm sitting next to Mr. Booth, who used to be the GM at GLTC until recently. I won't put him on the spot, but I think the quickest explanation of that is that the relationship between GLTC and Liberty University changed during the period that is part of that look back for the data. So that was a financial or an operating cost hit for GLTC and a ridership hit for GLTC. So that is something that we anticipated seeing, and that goes back to the comment I made earlier. The formula is working as it should, because when your operating cost goes down, your service profile gets smaller, and your ridership goes down, you would expect to see that decline.
Okay, and that is largely a result of Liberty taking over a greater share of that part of the transit market.
Yes, they withdrew from GLTC and they have done their own thing.
Got it.
Yes.
Thank you. Makes good sense to me.
Yeah,
And just to complete the circle, when I was on CTB, I sat next to Shannon Valentine.
It's the 3 degrees of separation between all of us in Lynchburg.
Yeah, it was about $1 million reduction in expenses out of an $8 million budget. So it's a pretty sizable percentage.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and to that point, that's actually illustrated on the slide that's up right now. So these next 2 slides just kind of illustrate the change in operating costs between FY19 and 21, which were the baselines kind of used for each of the scenarios that we're comparing. So for FY21, we use 19. The FY24 scenario, we're looking at FY21. And so, as you can see here, VREs went up by about 5%. Loudoun County came down by about 13% due to continued suspension of some of their commuter services in FY21. GLTC came down by 17% due to losing the Liberty University service and the ridership along that service. And I wanted to note here that not all agencies experiencing a decrease are projected to receive less funding in FY24. So WADA and Valley Metro, you can't really see it on there, but they have a teeny reduction. Both of them saw reduced operating costs, but still are projected to receive more money, which is to show that operating cost isn't the only thing that influences it. It has to do with ridership and the other metrics as well. Next slide. Similar dynamic here on the lower 2 quartiles. Radar saw a 13% decrease as they stopped providing rural service to Roanoke County. Their relationship with Roanoke County changed over this period of time. Farmville provided less service in FY21 to the Longwood College area, since there were far less students on campus than usual. And Pony Express, our Chincoteague service, which is a seasonal service, they reduced service offerings, I believe, both in FY20 and 21 summer, which accounts for their operational.
So there actually might be another example of where we may see that coming.
Exactly.
Because people are going to start going down.
Exactly. And so this is a limitation also to the data that we're using to fund these scenarios, because we're not looking at the FY22, and we're not looking at, of course, at next year. Yeah, okay. Next scenario. I'm sorry, next. So another takeaway here is that through this analysis, we also determined that VRE doesn't really have the benefit of having operating costs factor into their sizing metrics. The commuter rail pool looks at PMT, revenue hours, and revenue miles. Prior to the pandemic, this benefited VRE because their PMT was so much greater than, or compared to the rest of the state, it was such a large amount that this actually worked out in their favor. But over the past few years, as the landscape of commuting services has really changed, that is not necessarily the case anymore. And so that is one thing we will look at as we're going through these various scenarios. So you can go to the next slide, but I will take a moment just to pause, just to make sure we're all on the same page thus far.
I'm still losing over Pony Express. I didn't realize I still had that.
Yeah, they operate between May and September, I think.
Yeah.
If I could, Mr. Chair, again, just to sort of reground us on what the flexibilities that you have and don't have, right, as the DRBT. We're talking about, obviously, the law says certain things have to be allocated. We've got this performance system. Is there any flexibility at all for any, even part of the funding to be used as hold harmless or anything like that? I mean, what is the art of the possible for, and maybe we do get it at the formula, but if I'm hearing, again, you may not want to get rid of a formula, but are there certain fixes? And you guys have the legislative flexibility to help perhaps those who are dramatically affected without, throwing out the formula. I just don't know what you have. Like, I don't know what tools you have.
Can I ask you to be patient, because I think you've got something that
Perfect.
will get you there.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a few options in here that will get at that, but yeah.
And also those scenarios that we're going to go through later on, they don't necessarily have to be implemented, forever. We could always say, let's do this for 1 year, for 2 years.
Because I'm a firm believer that if a formula is working, that's great, but we think we've recognized where we are in time. And so that's part of this.
And I think that's really important. And, we have to, by CTV policy, every year, convene TSDAC and talk about the outcomes of the process. And I think, if there's I'll say in air quotes, solution that gets us through 24 in a way that kind of unravels us from this holding pattern we've been in, because I don't think that's something we can continue to do, but doesn't upend the formula, gets us through the next year, and then we come back to TSDAC and we say, okay, where are we now? That may be the best solution. But we did have some questions, particularly around VRE, which is why we ran some very specific scenarios, because, obviously, look at Kate, because they're the half owners of VRE, but obviously the Commonwealth has a great stake in VRE as well, with transforming rail in Virginia. And so, we've got to figure out how to disentangle ourselves from COVID.
Yeah.
And I think, to me, that's the most important thing for us to do.
Could I interject a point? I hate to keep going back to this. Literally, I was in farm board yesterday and having a discussion. This reminds me a lot of what in the education arena we have the local composite index that determines who gets what money under the formula. And we have known in Virginia for decades that thing does not work. It has to be changed. But nobody's prepared to step up and change it, because the first thing people do when they look at it is, well, how does this impact me? If I lose money, I'm not going to be for change. And you've got to have a whole harmless part, maybe at the transition stage, in order to kind of get it right. But you're not benefited by continuing to have a patchwork formula going forward. So at some point, you have to step up and make the necessary changes, bite the bullet, put in some money to make sure you deal with the whole harmless issue and move forward. So I just throw that out there, because I don't want to see us every other year having to discuss the same thing.
Yes. All right. Dan's like, can I get back to my presentation?
No, the conversation is great, because this is where we need to end up. And so I just anticipate that we're going to stop at pretty much every one of these scenarios to have discussion, which is great. Okay, so the first group of scenarios, we tested the sensitivity around alterations to the commuter rail sizing step of the project. So this included 4 scenario runs, one where we eliminated the commuter rail pool step entirely, and we ran the sizing for VRE based on exactly how we do it for other agencies. Scenario 3, we modified the sizing metric. We still kept the commuter rail sizing pool step, but we modified those metrics to include 50% operating cost or expenses, 30% PMT instead of ridership, 10% hours, and 10% miles. Scenario 4, we also modified the commuter rail pool step and looked at 60% cost and 40% PMT. And in the last one, we looked at 60% cost and 40% ridership. Yes?
As a reminder, what's the current
formula. The current one is, it's 33% PMT, 33% hours, and 33% miles. Okay. All right, next slide, please. And so each of the following scenarios are kind of presented in the same way, so I just wanted to go over that real quick. It's a description followed by some notes on why we chose that scenario and some of the high-level impacts of that, followed by bar graphs and the scatter plots illustrating the results. So under scenario 2, like I said, we eliminated the commuter rail sizing step entirely. And so what that means is that the size weight for VRE was calculated the same way that we do it for all other agencies, which is 50% cost, 30% ridership, 10% hours, 10% miles. For this one, we wanted to introduce the metrics that we use for other transit agencies to understand the impact that that would have on our commuter rail system. Part of thinking is that introducing operating costs here reduces the impact of ridership fluctuations, but also the scenario eliminates the need to calculate DMT, which can be challenging due to some of the data constraints. The results were that it led to a slight increase in the allocation to VRE of about $1.1 million and proportional decreases across the board for other agencies, except for those that hit their 30% cap. Next slide, please. So in the upper two quartiles, GRTC, Blacksburg, Valley Metro, WADA, and Harrisonburg all still hit the 30% cap. VRE is projected to receive 50% less than they did in FY21, Loudon 31%, GLCC 38%, and all other agencies experienced a slight drop of about 1 to 2% to get there. Similar in the lower two quartiles. The agencies that were projected under the first scenario to hit their 30% cap still do, and all other agencies drop in the 1 to 2% range here. And for the scatter plot, next slide, please. It looks very similar to scenario 1. The same agencies remain outliers in both the positive and negative quadrants, the only real change is that everybody comes down slightly. You can't really note it on a scatter plot like this. And so I'll pause here for questions about this. If there are none. Yeah, I can continue to go through them and then we can kind of discuss them as a group.
And I'll just chime in and say that we've had several discussions about the slide deck before it ever went out, and as Dan walked through these slides, the thing that kept popping in my mind is, what are the unintended consequences of making any of these kind of more dramatic shifts in a formula that we've only really used a few times, and so that.
Yeah, it's something to keep in mind here with any of the changes. And we've run a couple of sensitivity testing formulas too to see how things would look if they returned back to pre-pandemic kind of ridership levels.
And just to confirm, if I may, Mr. Chair, really quick, Brian's question, you said 33 for passenger miles, 33 for, what was it?
Revenue hours and revenue miles.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I believe it is noted in one of the slides too, if you wanted to refer back to it. I forget which number. All right.
And Dan, can I stop you
Please.
for 1 second also? So as you'll see as we walk through these different commuter rail sizing scenarios, the impact to VRE changes over these scenarios, and pretty much any time VRE's allocation goes up, the rest of the group goes down because they make up such a large share of the operating allocation. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're working through it.
Again, just to go back to what the code says, is that VRE needs to play in this formula as it's presented. So we can't pull VRE out of this process at this moment in time.
Correct. But this body, this body 4 years ago said commuter rail is distinctly different. And that's why the sizing metric was done the way that it was.
Exactly. So, recognizing that commuter rail, 3 scenarios we've kind of tried to address that. So, in scenario 3, what we did here was, of course, we retained the commuter rail pool sizing step of the formula, but we modified the metrics that go into it. And so under this formula, we use 50% operating costs for sizing, 30% PMT. Notably, for the rest of the agencies, it's ridership. Here it's PMT, and then 10% hours, 10% miles. The thinking here was introducing factors from the sizing step for other agencies while also recognizing the unique character of VRE and keeping it separate and applying its own kind of metrics here. So the scenario does have the same percentage weightings as those other agencies, as I just mentioned, but introducing operating costs for VRE helps to reduce the fluctuations due to ridership changes. Also using PMT here and not ridership recognizes the longer trip length of VRE trips. And so it more accurately represents their ridership as a metric. So if you go to the next slide, you can see what the results give us. So again here, GRTC, Blacksburg, WADA, and Harrisonburg all still hit the 30% cap. Notably, Valley Metro falls out of that group, but they are very close. All other agencies here, except for VRD, experience a proportional drop of about 3 to 4% across the board. And under this scenario, VRE is projected to receive 30% less than in FY21. Of course, that's compared to about 60% in scenario 1. Loudoun and GLTC notably are also still projected to receive roughly 33 and 40% less, respectively. In the lower quartile, all of those 7 agencies that I mentioned a moment ago still hit their 30% cap, and all of the other ones that are not at 30% cap come down by about 44%. So as Grant mentioned, all of these, because we're tweaking the sizing metric, it doesn't really impact the other, it impacts the other agencies by pulling potential money away from them, but it's really aimed at changing how we are determining the size weight for VRE. So the scatter plot looks similar. The only real movement here is that VRE is a little closer to center.
And what's the dollar amount on that?
I'm sorry?
What's the dollar impact on that?
The dollar impact, I'll have to refer to the sheet here. So between in FY, sorry, find that. Okay, in FY21, it was about 12 million you're saying for VRE?
Yes, right.
Yeah, they received 12 million in FY21. In scenario 3, they have received about 8.5 million. So, yeah, 3.5 million. And then the scatter plot here. Again, everything else is pretty much in the same place with slight decreases, and VRE moves 20%. In scenario 4, right? Again here, we retain the commuter rail sizing full step, but instead of the weight that I just described, we use 60% operating costs and 40% passenger miles traveled. Again here, we wanted to introduce operating costs as a sizing factor, while also recognizing the unique character of VRE. And I will note here that VRE's PMT and operating costs as a share of the whole state are very similar, so changing the percentages around would not result in a big change. If it was 80-20, 70-30, it would be about the same across the board. Next slide. So under this scenario, there's even bigger shifts, of course. Only 3 agencies in the upper 2 quartiles are able to hit their 30% cap under this scenario. That's Blacksburg, WADA, and Harrisonburg. GRCC is quite close, but they come just off of the mark. VRE is projected to receive 17% less than they did in FY21. Again, that's compared to about 60% under the first scenario. Loudoun and GLTC are projected to come down by 34 and 41%, and all other agencies experience a drop proportional about in the 4 to 5% range. Same thing goes on the lower quartiles. Notably here, those 7 agencies are still able to hit their 30% cap, so they stay in the same place. All of the other agencies come down by about 4 to 5%. And the scatter plot illustrates that. Everything's coming a little closer to center, and VRE makes some bigger moves here. And then I'll just quickly go through scenario 5, and then we can stop and talk about these commuter rail sizing scenarios, kind of all of the group. So under scenario 5, we again retained the commuter rail step, but we calculated sizing for VRE based on 50% operating costs and 40% ridership. Again, here we wanted to introduce operating costs as a kind of a stabilizing factor, but notably here, ridership does not necessarily reflect the unique nature of VRE. And so what we see on the next slide as a result is that, again, GRTC, Blacksburg, Water, and Harrisonburg still hit the 30% cap. VRE is projected to receive 44% less than FY21 under this scenario. All other agencies are expected to drop in the 2 to 3% range at this one, including Loudon and GLTC, which come down slightly. And here's the scatter plot. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's the lower half. Similar story here, where all of those 7 agencies are still able to hit their 30% cap, and all of those other agencies come down by about 2 to 3%. And then the scatter plot just kind of reflects that. So it's very similar to, I think, scenario 3. So the outliers in the positive are still the same agencies, and the outliers in the negative are still the same. So I will pause here to discuss these. And so I guess the idea here was we wanted to see what kind of like weighting different metrics within the commuter rail sizing step would look like. And this is kind of the spread that we land on. I did not note when I was explaining scenario 5 that VRE's ridership as a percentage of the statewide ridership is significantly lower than their operating costs. So changing those percentages around would result in significant changes. Questions or thoughts, or do we want to move on?
Mr. Chair, if I could, you mentioned that you had done some additional sensitivity analysis using pre-COVID data. I kind of wonder, if you could broadly describe for these scenarios, kind of, I imagine that there would be a bigger chunk of the funding pie that VRE was taking up with that pre-COVID stuff, with all these, except for maybe scenario 2, but these things where we're kind of changing around the commuter rail sizing pool, or commuter rail pool sizing. Could you describe kind of the impact with pre-COVID data?
Certainly. And so we, keeping everything else equal, we just looked at VRE returning to pre-pandemic PMT levels to see what impact that would have. Because a couple of these scenarios pan out fairly well for VRE compared to what we're projecting them to receive next year. And so we looked at scenarios 3 and 4, which were the most generous towards VRE, to see what they would look like if their PMT level went back up to that pre-pandemic level. And so under scenario 3, that would result in VRE actually receiving 11% more than they got in FY21. And in scenario 4, it led to them receiving significantly more, 38% more. And so that is something to keep in mind, because VRE is aiming at getting back at those pre-pandemic levels. So we wanted to know how that would kind of pan out here too.
I mean, it's hard, and I know, I'm sure as others are, it's frustrating to solve for one problem, because that's not fair to the rest of other folks. And so hopefully it's a place where we can look to VRE. But Jen mentioned it, and I feel it's important to say it again. The Commonwealth has committed an awful lot in capital funding. VRE, NBTC just issued a huge bond purchase using local money to support the Transform Rail in Virginia. And so for state aid to be potentially reducing for something that the state has effectively asked VRE to commit a huge bond issuance is really hard. I mean, it's just really, really hard. In some ways, I wish we could just put the VRE conversation, it's potentially political or otherwise, over here on how that gets funded, so that we can spend more time talking about rewarding all the great stuff that's going on. But that's the hardest thing for me sitting on the NBTC side, is that, I mean, we just issued like a huge bond issuance all about supporting VPRA and their capital improvements that are going to benefit VRE. So to see a reduction in state aid potential after this huge capital outlay is just really hard. And so we can't have, I mean, the optics are just really bad. They're just really bad to see that there would be a loss. But I really, really, really wish, and maybe this is something to get changed, in the future legislatively, but all these great things at GRTC and Fairfax Connector and Dash and Arlington, and I have to say all my other transit systems, I want them to be rewarded, and it really just kills me that we're kind of an apples and oranges conversation with all this other great stuff that the transit bus systems have been doing, to then have this conversation about VRE. Yeah, it's really hard.
And to that point, I think getting to Jen's point also is that, and Brent's point is that possibly the solutions coming out of COVID are to address short-term, smaller changes that could keep things a little bit more
There's
even.
commitment to the long bridge. It's going to take a couple years. Right.
To Dan's point, with all these scenarios, again, you can implement them for as long as you want. We can revisit them down the road. These commuter rail sizing ones, though, are a little bit different because they're based on the metrics that we're using, whereas the other buckets that we're looking at are more safety valves. And so those could be very easily implemented for just 1 year as a transition period. This is a little bit different because we're actually changing the formula. So just something to consider.
And you could do that temporarily too, but it's difficult to explain.
Always known that this is kind of the odd duck, right?
I mean, we struggled over this 3 years ago.
Sure, right. And, as I'm thinking about what we're trying to accomplish here, my first sense is that in terms of vast majority of, actually almost everybody, we are looking at, rewarding improved performance from what is an evolving but basic system that's already out there. With a couple of these cases, we're looking at something different. And there's a Loudon example. We're not going to see Metro expanding into every community that's got a bus system that needs to adjust to that.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an anomaly.
Right. With VRE, I think what we would want to have a sense of is that commuter traffic coming back, and you don't want to interfere with their ability to offer.
Or maybe I would argue is what is the ability of that system to be able to pivot to the changing travel behavior in the case of a fixed rail, passenger rail system. They can't pivot like some of our colleagues at Fairfax. I can speak everywhere from Fairfax Connector to Dash and CRTC as well. They've actually effectively pivoted because they can, because buses can move.
Right.
You can't add that fourth track in Alexandria and Arlington and another bridge overnight. So VRE's ability to react, all of these other systems, I would say, that are in that positive space have reacted, and kudos to them, right? And that's what we want, just getting back to Jen saying that we want to be able to celebrate that.
So I guess I'm wondering whether there's a way to sort of recognize that the system that's working for the vast majority of entity is working, and how do we solve the problem, the anomalous situations
without throwing off everybody else, right?
So you just have a separate system. For now, recognition of the fact that they are different.
Well, and of course we've had, but now we may need to ask whether is that going to work going forward?
Yeah. Mr. Chair.
Yes, Dr. Snoop.
Thank you. Let me just share with the group, and Jennifer can, she hears some of this too, I'm sure. There is early but growing conversation within CTB with regard to right-sizing of transit of all kinds. And that relates primarily, when you get down to the bottom line, to the decline in ridership, particularly in VRE and in Metro, which is largely attributed, I assume rightfully, but I don't really know this, to the federal government not returning to in-office work. I wonder if, given that particular Metro and to probably a similar extent VRE was conceived in part to assure effective and efficient transit of federal workers, if we should not, as the Commonwealth, inform the federal government that we expect them, since this is of their making for the most part, to be part of the financial solution.
If I could weigh in on that, sort of timing is everything. I had occasion to have dinner with Governor Hogan of Maryland on Tuesday, and I specifically asked him about Metro. And his response was not unlike what we just heard, in the sense of it's time for the federal government to step up and do more, given the fact that a large chunk, and I think the figure, Kate can speak to that, I think is like 45% of the ridership.
Even higher for VRE.
Yeah, are federal employees. That the federal government needs to be an equal, or if not larger, partner in helping pay for this. And if that's the position that he would like to advocate, and he's certainly willing to work with our governor and the mayor, maybe to see what we can do to get some push on that. And I just kind of throw that out there for whatever it is. So to the extent you're having those discussions, what I'm trying to say is, I think it's a fertile topic, and that there's some of them willing to help be a part of that. And having served on CTV and on the Metro board, I think I got a unique perspective on this issue. So I'm happy to talk to you about what we can do to address it, to be honest with you.
Thank you, Jim.
Any other comments, thoughts?
So just thoughts on, are we talking about thoughts on the scenarios? Or are you done? Okay. So I actually, when I was just kind of thinking about operating costs, so obviously operating costs for any transit system is whatever you put into your kitchen sink. And I'm not sure if that's always the best way to measure anyone, especially VRE. So when I was looking at the scenarios and what they comprise of, and then I just tried to tie it back to funding, I was actually more in favor of 3 and 4, just because, and this may not be your point, Kate, but if we are trying to measure them differently, we need to measure them, in my mind, on the goals that the state or the region has for them, which includes providing more service, and I know there's a capacity issue for time and tracks and access, but rewarding them for, in this case, it was passenger miles traveled for scenario 4. For scenario 3, it was hours and miles, which again gets to the point of we want to reward them for doing what we're asking them to do. So I guess my comments to the group, if we were to look at scenarios or scenario implementation, still be true to the formula and what we're trying to do as far as performance, then those make the most sense to me, because it does, in my mind, this isn't what sensitivity testing is, but it does give them the reward for doing what the Commonwealth has asked them to do, which is to provide service regardless of what's going on in the universe. But I do think that options or the feedback on operating costs does tell them, just like it tells my agency and everybody else around the table, you still have to run your business efficiently. And are there things that you can do different to be able to do that? Not saying there is or isn't for them or anyone else, but I do think, that does make you evaluate what you get, because the first question I would ask is, you're doing what we told you to do, so you're providing service at this level in spite of the pandemic, but what have you done as a business beyond your audited statements, what we do every day as transit leadership to make sure that your business is running right. So one of the challenges that we've had with commuters is, Jamie, I need you to bring back commuter service. Well, as of last week, VRE is only at 25% of where it was a couple of years ago. As a business decision, as a transit system, if I brought commuter service back for 4 people on a bus, I should not be rewarded for that. So my comments are, I think 3 and 4 are good scenarios. I mean, I would lean on this group in discussions on if that modifies, or if anything in those percentages are modified, or are those just good percentages because you put in the work. But I do think having non-operating cost factors that are included in those do speak to what we're trying to do. Give a formula that's clear, in my mind, that's fair, and that does require all of us as transit systems, commuter rail, passenger rail, et cetera, to actually analyze our business and make sure that we are providing good service. And transit systems have to do that too. My concern is, and I think we earlier was mentioned, like, you know, do we have a safety net and what that looks like? And I think that's okay. But then for this group, if we do it for VRE, when you have another transit bus system that is in that same spot, they're going to have that same expectation, which I don't think is a bad idea. But in some cases, for anybody who has done ridership forecasting, and all of our studies, this group, I think we need to be careful about rewarding what people project, because in some cases that never, well, in most cases that never materializes. And so then does the region get their money back? No, because, you know, your books are closed for that year. So overall, my comments 3 and 4, I think, are the most reasonable in my mind. Again, love to hear group discussion on that. And 2, if we do some sort of safety net, I'll just say dollar-wise, then what does that look like, and how do we give DRBT staff the ability to make sure that maybe not so much it's meeting all the goals, but it's meeting what the intention is of that particular safety net, whatever it is, because running a system is hard, as you all know, but when you get in financial trouble, whew, that is a doozy. And you don't have that year to fix it. You've got to fix it in that fiscal year. And to ask localities for those dollars is a good way to get fired quickly. So that's my long spiel to say 3 and 4. I like the idea of a safety net I'll say safety net, but that's not I don't know what the correct terminology should be, right sizing period for a year or whatever. But I think that would be kind of my comment. Sorry, Mr. Chair, that was
thanks.
say like 5 words.
Very helpful. Dr. Smoot, did you want to add something, or?
No, thank you.
Anyone else have some comments?
Mr. Chair, I will say quickly, kind of back to Jen's original point, I'm kind of not in favor of these scenarios, because it is changing that underlying formula that does seem to be working, you know, outside of COVID craziness. So, you know, I'm kind of more interested in discussion of the other scenarios that haven't gone over yet, and kind of what the impacts of those may be.
Okay. Well, then why don't we move on and then come back and we've had a chance to see them all, and circle back and say, well, what does it make the most sense now?
Sounds good. So, thank you. In this second grouping of scenarios, we ran sensitivity testing around modifications to the funding cap. Currently, that cap is set at 30%. And so what we did here is we are presenting 2 scenarios where we look at what our allocations would look like without a funding cap at all, and what it would look like with a 25% funding cap. Now, I'll note here we also ran a 35% funding cap scenario, but it looked almost exactly the same as with no funding cap, so we just didn't carry it forward just for time constraints in this.
And Danica, just to clarify, that is no more than X% growth from the previous year. When you're talking about a funding cap, it means that they don't grow more?
No, this is the funding, this is the operating funding cap. So it's saying that,
What is the cap?
we will only provide up to 30% of the total operating budget.
This was
I want to make sure that
we're talking, right, this was the provision that we put in to the formula back in 2018 so that we didn't see any agency kind of run off. What we saw it was some of the smaller.
With a large percentage of their total operating costs being subsidized by the state.
Right. And so capping that at 30% means once you hit that 30% mark, we just keep iteratively running the formula until everything is distributed.
Good question. And, yes, so it is a maximum right now of 30% of the previously audited operating expenses, okay? So it's for the year back. I will note here that these scenarios simply illustrate what would happen if the funding cap was changed. They do not answer the question of whether or not that funding cap should change, because that is a matter of policy. I think there's arguments for keeping it the same, for getting rid of it, and for reducing it. So these, like I said, these just illustrate what happens when you do those things. Next slide, please. So in scenario 6, we kept everything else equal. So we kept the commuter rail sizing as it is today with no modifications. We kept the transit sizing as it is today with no modifications, and we just changed the funding cap to remove it entirely. This results in a few agencies receiving higher allocations because they can exceed that 30% cap now, and proportional decreases for the remaining agencies. Those receiving higher allocations are all of those that hit their 30% cap in scenario 1 and some of those others. So under this scenario, GRTC, Blacksburg, WADA, Harrisonburg all see increases exceeding that cap. All other agencies that would not have hit the 30% cap under scenario 1, which is the FY24 projected, they all see reductions in the 1% to 2% range. Notably here, VRE is projected to receive 61% less than their FY21 allocation compared to 59 under that first scenario. Loudon 32% less compared to 29, GLTC 39% less compared to 37. So this doesn't help those agencies that are having projected decreases. Just allows those that are doing well to receive a higher allocation. Did you have a question, Kate?
Well, just, and again, it may not even matter, but does this reflect at all the fact that some of the systems are able to get operating funding provided by the state? I mean, not state, by the feds? Yeah.
No.
But there's no impact on being a 5311 for recipient or a small.
There's not. Everything is in the lower 2.5. Same dynamic applies. All of the agencies that were hitting the 30% cap under scenario 1 all receive increases under the scenario, and all others drop slightly. And the agencies are all dropping slightly because they don't benefit from that the funding above that 30% being redistributed through the formula. And so what you'll see on the scatter plot is it's very similar, but it's actually the widest spread because those that are doing the best are able to exceed that 30% and go even higher, and those that are projected to have decreases go slightly lower. And so, yeah, that is scenario 6. I think seeing the next scenario would be helpful before we stop and discuss because that is a much more interesting dynamic, I think. Next slide, please. So under scenario 7 here, again, we kept everything else equal, and we just lowered the cap to 25%. So this is saying that an agency can only receive up to 25% of the previously audited operating expenses. Okay, so this results in a few of those higher performing agencies receiving allocations or lower allocations compared to scenario 1, and some of those are even receiving lower compared to FY21 because they're not able to hit their 30% cap, which they were getting previously. All of those agencies with initial allocations of less than 25% also benefit from the scenario because they benefit from the money after the cap is applied being redistributed back into the program. Okay, so next slide, please. So here I have a number of notes to walk through here because there's a lot going on here. So GRTC, Blacksburg, WADA, and Harrisonburg, all of those agencies that were hitting their 30% cap before, they're all still hitting the cap, and it's now at 25%, which results in a decreased allocation compared to scenario 1. Okay? There's also additional agencies that are now hitting the 25% cap. That includes CAT, ART, DASH, City of Fairfax, Petersburg, and Bay Area. So the red mark on here is still representing the 30% cap just to show the scale, but all of those agencies that are hitting the 25% cap, there's nothing to indicate that on here. It's just illustrated through the blue bars. All other agencies that don't hit the 25% cap see proportional increases based on their performance within the formula, and that ranges from a 1% increase to, say, an 11% increase, I think, for some of the agencies that benefit more. Again, these agencies are all benefiting because the funding after the cap is applied is reapplied through the program. So the way that funding is allocated now is proportional to how the agencies perform within the operating formula. So HRT and Fairfax, who are large agencies that are doing fairly well in the formula, they come out pretty well with this. They're getting a large percent of that redistributed money, whereas VRE doesn't get a lot of it because they're not performing well in the current formula. So HRT goes from having, I think we had an 8% increase projected for scenario 1 to having a 19% increase here. VRE is projected to receive 56% less than in FY21, which is slightly better than scenario 1. Loudon 22, GLTC 21, which are again slightly better than in scenario 1, but it still doesn't necessarily address their issues. On the lower two quartiles, again the same dynamic applies. All of the agencies that previously hit their 30% cap are now hitting the 25% cap, resulting in decreased allocations because 25% is less than 30, and 11 additional agencies are now hitting that 25% cap. And I can go through them, but that's essentially this entire list. VRT, Danville, District 3, 4 County, CSDAC, Radar, Suffolk, Winchester, Pulaski, Bristol, Greenville County. They're all at the top. All other agencies that don't hit that cap receive increases proportional to how they're performing in the formula, of course. And so the scatter plot here is quite different from the other ones that we've looked at, and it shows two different dynamics. All of the agencies that are projected to receive increases in FY24 compared to 21 move down towards the zero line, so they kind of come in, and the agencies that are in the negative side go towards the zero line. So everything's kind of closing in here, which would be, the whole harmless line. Additionally, most of the smaller agencies in the scenario are projected to see decrease because of that 25% cap, bringing them down. So they'll just come in a little bit more than that. So I'll pause there, and we can kind of discuss what modifying the funding cap does to them.
And as the resident historian, I will say that the 30% funding cap, for those that don't remember, was established based on kind of the historical highest percentage that agencies like Blacksburg and Harrisonburg had received in state assistance. And so that was a somewhat deliberate choice. And so modifications to that are deviating from kind of that historical share, and that there's a range in share that varies by agency size, but it was like 15 to 30% when we looked at this back in 2018.
I believe in FY21, the lowest was 16%.
Chair, this is Cindy. May I make a comment?
Sure, please do.
First, I wanted to say thanks for the scenarios. For me, it did help to see all of the scenarios, what the impact was. And again, thank you for the scatter plots. For me, it's hard to just talk concepts without seeing it play out. I know there's work behind the scenario, so I wanted to acknowledge and say thank you. I think it also reinforced for me, knowing we still have 2 more scenarios to go through, but from where we are now, it reinforced for me the general concepts we had last time and where Jen started today. the formula and the work we've done, as the historian noted, all the way till to date, still seems to be holding true. So it reinforces the points made several times today that we need to look at a transition or a one more year hold harmless. I don't think we will ever be, quote, normal and back to where we were before COVID, but I do think we have uneven recovery to date. So it'd be good to use, in my current situation where I'm thinking based on these scenarios, use the current formula for one more year and then try to figure out how to adjust that uneven recovery piece in knowing we have some big issues with VRE and then like new systems coming on. So those are my initial thoughts, but I also wanted to make sure I said thank you for the scenario runs.
Thank you, Ms. Nestor. Anybody else have comments?
I just have just a practical question, because obviously we're talking about a funding allocation that you can use based upon certain numbers. Obviously, there's the budget, the state budget is not finalized yet. So the other thing is, will the pot anticipate to potentially change depending on what we hear in the next week from governor's amendments?
So that is correct. There is no state budget yet.
Yeah.
And so that does mean that everything that's in our 6-year program, including for fiscal 23, is still a draft until there's a state budget. We're not talking about changing fiscal 23. We're talking about 24. So if you'll recall, when we talked about funding, we've had this kind of little bit of a bubble in 22 and 23. It's a couple of things. One, it's the revenue adjustment coming out of some very conservative revenue estimates, coming out of very conservative revenue estimates during COVID in 20 and 21. The other is the percentages that are set in code for the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. There was flexibility prior to FY24 when all of the revenue sources that were in the 2020 omnibus bill come to fruition. So there's an adjustment there with how the percentages kind of level out in 24. So what you see in the numbers for 24, it's less than what is in the draft 6-year program for this year, but it is in line with the historical trend line for the operating assistance program in the low 100, well over $100 million.
Obviously, just need to understand that there's going to be some changes to gas tax that may affect future revenue sources that fund the transportation cost.
Mr. Chair, in my mind, these two scenarios kind of solidify in my mind that 30% is the right cap. You know, the fact that looking at it higher or just unconstrained, you know, you had very few hitting any kind of cap. And then when you go down to 25%, having so many hitting it, I think that kind of tells us we're at the right place if we're looking at those 5% increments. So that was great to see that, you know, it's working as intended, I think.
Any other comments? Yeah, I tend to Sam's point there that there seems to be a good spot to be in when you don't have most agencies, you know, bumping up against that limit.
Projecting to have next year, and of course that could change if we had significantly less operating funds. That would be very different for us. Okay, we can move on to the last two scenarios. And these scenarios are looking at what we're calling an operating floor. So this is responding to TSDAC's comments and requests to look at kind of setting guardrails around the formula to prevent drastic changes from happening for any given agency. And so similar to how a cap works, setting 30% as the maximum of the previously audited expenses, this sets a minimum for all agencies compared to this previously audited expenses. Next slide. We looked at two different scenarios. This one, keeping all else equal, we looked at what it would do to a minimum floor of 15%, and then we did a 10% one. And so under scenario 8, the 15% floor, it's in line, like what Jen just said, the minimum received by any agency in FY21, but also prior to that, prior to the new formula, it was also in line with the minimum received by any agency. And notably here, unprojected FY24 run, the only agency with an initial allocation of less than 15% of their total budget, it was VRE. And so the next few slides show the impact of what implementing this would be. So for the two quartiles, ensuring all agencies receive this minimum of 15%, but also not exceeding the 30%. No agencies in the larger half of our agencies are able to hit their 30% cap anymore. Some are very close, but they're all slightly below. The only agency that would receive an increase under this scenario is really VRE. And then all other agencies come down from scenario 1 in the 1 to 12% range, depending on the agency, based on the way that the formula kind of doles out the funds in that way. So VRE under this scenario is projected to receive 2% more than they did in FY21. And notably, Loudon and GLTC are still sitting at about 34% and 42% down. In the lower two quartiles, the same dynamic applies. No agencies here are able to hit the 30% cap, but some come very close. They're in the 29.8% range. And all come down, like I mentioned a moment ago, by about 1 to 2%, depending on how they are performing within the formula. And so the scatter plot looks very different again than others. All agencies in the positive quadrant are moving towards the center of the chart, and all those in the negative move slightly out further, with the exception of VRE, which is now slightly into the positive because they are projecting a 2% increase in this scenario. You'll like me to present the 10% scenario before we do that. Okay. So in scenario 9, we kept everything else equal. We kept the 30% cap, kept the sizing metrics the same, and we added up a minimum floor of 10% of operating costs. The 10% mark, notably here, is 5% lower than what any agency received back in 21. So it is a lower mark, but it still sets up some sort of guardrail against having the budgets completely bottom out. In this scenario as well, VRE was the only agency with an initial allocation of less than 10%. And so most agencies that hit the 30% under scenario 1 still do here. So GRTC, Blacksburg Valley, WADA, and Harrisonburg in the upper two quartiles hit their 30% cap. The only agency to receive an increase here, again, is VRE. So all other agencies either stay the same or down slightly from scenario 1. Under this scenario, VRE is projected to receive 32% less than they did in FY21, Loudon 32, and GLTC 39%. Under the bottom two quartiles, all of those 7 agencies I mentioned before, MEOC, Star, Farmville, Bluefield, Alta Vista, and Lake area, they all still hit their 30% cap here, and all other agencies dropped slightly based on their performance. And the scatter plot shows all of that. And the biggest difference between this one and the last one is that those agencies in the positive column spread out a little bit more, and VRE shifts back up to the negative quadrant. So I will stop there because that is the extent of my presentation. And I think there's a lot of discussion that could be had about these.
Thanks. Presentation for all the hard work. Seconding Cindy Master's comments. Discussion.
Mr. Chair, if I may, just a quick question, and I apologize if this is a dumb question because people do ask those. So for funding for the floor, options with the floor, if there's ever in the future a significant financial issue with the state, and we don't get enough money as, in general, how does that work with the floor?
We would have to probably find something within the policy that says that state allocation, or the total state allocation would have to be able to support the floor.
Okay. And from my perspective, I would not see this as a long-term change to the formula, but as a COVID disentanglement a year. By code, we have a performance-based formula.
Yeah.
And so this is not in keeping with the spirit of the code. And so from my perspective, the only way that this becomes plausible at all is as a short-term COVID disentanglement type thing. We had, when the formula changed in 2019, there was budget language that provided for some transition assistance, which got to a similar end. Basically, we ran the old formula and the new formula, and anybody that got something less under the new formula, there was one-time assistance. To me, this type of scenario is a one-time or a short-term way to kind of back ourselves out of COVID, but not a long-term change to formula because it is not keeping with the spirit of the code.
I have a question. Just to confirm, for the sizing, you used operating costs, the audited statements from 21. So when you actually would be doing the formula for 24 funding, you'd be using the 22 statements. That's correct. Because that's one thing that Farm Bill has jumped out to me as potentially being negatively impacted by that because of 21, there was no students at the university. Their operating costs were obviously a lot lower, but we're sort of in with them, how I've sort of been watching them as they're impacted across each of these scenarios. There's only formula where one option that they actually come out almost break even to what they would have received in 21. And I think that's because we're using operating costs that are reduced because of COVID. So I think that for me, that just looking at that one specific agency, it's on the other end of the spectrum of BRE. We're trying to figure out how to untangle out of COVID. Because 22 statements or operating costs may be more, which would not have the negative impact it's seen because they were hitting the 30% cap all the way across until you remove that cap.
And I think the thing we need to keep in mind in particular for the rural is we have 5311 federal money that takes care of it. And we can balance, some of those shifts out with the federal money.
Okay.
That's not the case for the small urbans or the larger. So I have a soft spot for the rural, and they do a great job for the Commonwealth, but we have a lot of resources that take care of them.
That's good to hear because just looking at a 30,000 decrease in a small agency like Farm Bill, I'm not trying to discredit DRE's position, but that's devastating for a small agency.
And you're here to represent CTEP, and that's your job. We've got to keep the federal piece in mind along with this. I think the other thing that is important to reflect is that at some point we're going to get new census data. And so that's going to start to shift folks' boundaries around and, do we pick up any more areas that transition from rural to urban or the other way, which has happened as well. That's another factor. We can run scenarios all day long, but we're running them based on what we know today. And to your point, there's audited financials for 22 that we don't have yet. There's complete ridership for 22 that we don't have yet. There's the census impact that we don't have yet. So the scenarios are only as good as the data that we have today. And there's a lot of things that will change between now and, as I said, this time next year. 9 months from now, when we're running this formula in whatever fashion we're running the formula at that point in time. We know are out there, but we can't account for all of those. We just have to do the best we can to get information in front of us.
So when we're looking at the outliers, and again, I don't day in, day out, but we're seeing WADA getting it up to that cap in most of these scenarios. I'm hearing Harrisonburg and I'm hearing Blacksburg, and is that primarily being driven by the reduced operating costs due to the reduced student populations in those places? Or would that normally have been bumping up against that cap if we were thinking about where things were previously?
So Blacksburg and Harrisburg have been bumping up against the cap since the 2018 formula was developed. I mean, they've got a relatively low operating cost profile and high ridership because of university communities. So that's to be anticipated. I think GRTC and the rousing success that they've had with Pulse and the redesign and their recovery approach from COVID and Bureau of Affairs, they're a little bit more of an outlier that I'm sure Sam would say, take care of the cap. We've done everything that we're supposed to, and we'd like more. Thank you very much. And we want to reward that. And I think that's the hard part of trying to find a balance, because we do want to reward good performance. I mean, that's stewards of the public dollar. We want to reward good performance, but we don't want to reward good performance at the detriment of services that are required to provide, lifeline services, connections to jobs, workforce development, education. And so I think that the interesting part is trying to figure out what that balance is. And that's what the cap has kind of served as part of making that balance happen over the last 4 years.
Thanks. And again, that kind of reinforces the idea that it sounds to me like cap is probably around the right place because there are not that many agents among the large ones that are bumping up against it.
Mr. Chair?
Okay.
Looking at this, the 15% floor, I'm not terribly enthused by that. From a rewarding good performance perspective, it's great to see VRE whole, but I'm not sure if are going to be performance driven, that's really a reasonable goal. However, in terms of limiting pain, looking at that 10% funding floor and, trying to look at a maybe 1 or 2 year formula-based solution to how to address that, I guess I would be curious, for VRE, is 2%, enough progress from the base scenario and the existing formula? What do you guys think?
Well, I was going to say, and I think when there's opportunity for public comment, staff would be picking up on that if the technology enables. And so, because I think that's the real-time conversation. There are not very many opportunities for operating costs, as we know. We talked about the federal space. There was, thank God, for some of the COVID funds help supplement, but these guys don't get operating funds from other buckets. I've actually literally been checking, like, if you already have operating funds, like any other place we can find money, couch cushions, anything. So I'm looking forward to see what their thoughts are on this, specifically. Yeah. I'm pretty sure, though, that their COVID funding to cover operating is like large and in charge of keeping them running right now. Mm-hmm. So having it spill over to 24, I think, is almost near impossible. That would have been the great thing, right? That was the transition, right? But I don't think you're going to pass. It's going to be still available at that time.
Just a couple of quick items, Mr. Chair, if I may, on that point. I do agree with Sam. I'm not in favor of the floor, especially after your comment. And I will say VRE, along with Fred, we did get additional COVID money through GWRC. I can't remember what the amount was for VRE, but we did get some that, depending on when they're going to use it, which could be 23, but we did get some additional support from the region to run service. For us, it's going to carry us quite some long ways, so we are winning. But I would just say that there is some additional support, but the floor, just with your comments, yeah.
If I could weigh in, maybe I'm unique in this, but I'm willing to consider doing something separate to VRE, because if you look at the long-term role that they hopefully will play as we expand rail service in Virginia, as we expand rail service throughout the region. We was talking about having VRE going into Maryland and Maryland trains coming in here and expanding our passenger long bridge situation, they've got a role to play in the long term. And it may well be that we're going to have to set up something separate to keep that going, keep that viable as a long-term economic development investment. And have a separate way of approaching these others. Because we've already put a lot of money in VRE, it's got a lot of potential. And trying to tinker with things to maybe cover them a little bit, but not the way that I think just messing around the edges, quite frankly, I think we need to step up and at least consider that scenario.
Just to verify, I'm going to ask the question then. Outside of the scenarios that they've provided, is that even an option to do anything different for VRE? Because what I'm hearing is this is our options. What I'm hearing you say, Mr. Dyke, is there something different that we can do for VRE? And that's my question too. Yeah.
So within the confines of the code language, I think we are limited in what we can do.
Okay.
Then
So-
we need to change the code then?
I do not think it can be changed through CTV policy in the transit operating zone.
There may be some opportunity in that space. But right now, we have to look at.
Just have to raise if our judgment is we need to make some changes here just based on where we're going, what economic future is, and that somebody needs to take a look at this seriously as we go through this old Virginia approach of, well, let's have a study commission. Somebody's got to talk about it.
Right.
We just can't say, well, gee, well, we can't do that. So let's figure out how we make, a E-class system work as opposed to actually stepping up. Isn't that our role if we think something's needed to say that? They may say no, but at least we need to raise it.
I think I'll call some nuance. And I sit here as not only the acting director of the RPT, but the chair of the VPRA board. So I'm a little awkward, and we have a lot of relationships with VRE as part of transforming rail in Virginia. So I'm kind of wearing two hats. I think TSDAC is charged with advising us and the Commonwealth Transportation Board as it pertains to the operating formula. And I think we all can recognize that VRE is really the greatest outlier based on the formula. But the formula itself is working. So do you address the formula or do you address the outlier? And that's what I'm hearing from the group. And it's, do you try to do something to address a unique set of circumstances around VRE? I don't think you can do that within the formula as it's defined by code, because it is a performance-driven formula, and performance is defined by CTV policy and the work of this group as heavily dependent on ridership. It's not something that VRE is under control. It's within their control. I mean, really, it goes back to when is the federal workforce going to go back into the office? And that's going to drive the future of VRE. They're going to come back. They're going to come back and they'll be fine. That's why we continue to charge forward with transforming rail in Virginia. It's how do you get them through this period of time before we start seeing that happen? And, whatever the reason, Kate started out and said, there might be another solution. I don't know that it's something that can be driven by CTV formula.
The question I think if I'm hearing correctly, is does this TSDAC board have the authority to make a legislative recommendation? And I swear I don't know where our limits is. I'm pretty sure there are going to be others who are recipients that will be interested in moving forward on a legislative recommendation. I don't know if TSDAC as a body, if we can say we recommend the I don't know. I'm assuming we can say what we want, but I'm assuming our charge is not including a legislative proposal, even if we may want it. Right? Am I hearing correctly, Mr. Dunn?
At least we could have a sense of TSDAC, at least somebody out there listening might bring together a legislative proposal. I don't see anything wrong with that.
Well, I just to talk about this organization, this body. I mean, we are a Transit Service Delivery Advisory Commission. We have a charge that we were given in the legislation, but that in developing this, we all recognized over time that VRE is a different animal, that we were told you have to include it, but maybe we should at least think about the possibility that we can, based on our experience, point to the fact that it is challenging to include that particular agency in the way in which we're trying to drive innovation and success transit agencies in meeting their needs. I guess I'd say I don't see anything wrong with pointing to an issue that exists.
No, I really, in fact, I actually think I've been saying that, so I hope that there was a recognition 3 years ago as well.
Mm-hmm.
There needs to be something fixed. This is just not, it hurts others, and that's.
So is that a formal recommendation, or I'm just trying to figure out? I didn't make a motion. I'm just asking a question. Yeah, I'm not going to. Because if it is causing a challenge in the funding formula for everyone else, and we are working this hard for the outliers, if somebody's recommendation from the committee is that whomever, I don't know who that entity is it DRPT, or do we direct VPRA, or do we direct VRE to address this issue? But, even though our charge isn't we're supposed to focus on this, and I think we should continue to do that. If there is a recommendation for somebody to take action, I do agree with you that we say, this record, we said somebody do something that is not us, because that is not our charge. But I don't have any issue with that, because we're definitely spending a lot of time to try to fix somebody who, fix an agency, which the state's requirements for this agency and the investments that you have mentioned are already there. And I agree wholeheartedly with this is a long-range game, and we're not playing that right now, which is unfair to the transit agencies and for VRE.
I think it would be appropriate to say CTB, which has a statewide, it's Commonwealth Transportation Board. They have the overall responsibility. And we could suggest to them that they ought to consider, they need to suggest legislative action to address this problem and give them the opportunity to do that. I think that's totally appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess my expectation would be that I think that I'm reading the group correctly and saying that we feel the formula generally is working well.
Yes.
Okay. But that we want to highlight the fact that once again we're faced with the challenge of how to address this particular agency that faces challenges that are unlike those of the typical transit agency in the Commonwealth, and that some kind of way of addressing the issue is important, because we don't want to undercut the value that we're getting out of the system that we're charged to develop and recommend.
And as I said, put it in the context of not where we are today, but where we're going in the future. And as we look at our economy and where we're going, and the fact that we want to play in the region and get a lot of things done. And I think the business community would certainly get behind that. Because I know, for example, the Board of Trade, we've been advocating for years about having the trains, instead of stopping in D.C., go back and forth, because you've got people now going all around the region. And that's a reality. And at some point, we're going to have to step up and deal with that. And I realized in Virginia that sometimes people don't like to change. I mean, it's the old adage of how many Virginians does it take to change a light bulb? One to actually change it, and 5 to talk about how great the old light bulb was. Yawn at it at some point and take a longer view. Just saying.
So, Mr. Chair, how can we memorialize this? A sense of, is this a motion? Is this, how can we, I mean, it's always going to be in the live stream and all that good stuff, but you know.
Yes, well, I'm not sure that we want to make that determination today. I think that's what's going to be our final recommendation to the CTB. And I'd like to hear from those who can comment on that today, see what they may have to say about it as well. But I guess my sense is that, you know, we want to just point out some of the challenges of trying to shoehorn the VRE into this particular merit-based system. And you know, just to become more challenging, as you point out, the space connectivity. You know, how are you going to count rides then, or passenger miles when people may be transferring from one state to another? I think it's something bus systems don't typically have. Anyway, I think that would be my suggestion. We've now just kind of put this on the table, and again, I think there's a recognition that we want to highlight the fact that this was always the elephant in the room.
Yep. Yeah.
Right.
Thanks, Dan.
Now, in terms of the scenarios that are presented, anybody have anything else would like to provide to Dan?
I have a question quick. I know we like to work in these neat 5%, intervals, but given the kind of big disparity between the 10% floor and the 15% floor, did you kind of back of the envelope look at anything in between the two?
We did not, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility. I mean, if you can kind of assume what would happen, just looking at the two. So in the 15% scenario, VRE is just about where they were in FY21. In the 10% scenario, they were around 30% less, I think. And so, 32% less. So if you went with 12.5%, it would be somewhere in the 15 to 17% range. And so others would come down slightly to be able to keep that in that range. Within the scenarios that were presented, certainly small incremental changes can be made to explore those options as well.
Yeah, I think I'm very much on board with what my colleagues are suggesting here in terms of we need a legislative solution to kind of treat this very different mode differently. However, I guess I'm kind of concerned about in the meantime, do we want to look harder at a one-year safety rail, maybe involving a funding floor? Do we want to maybe get some additional information and look at what might be kind of the ideal percentage for something like that, or do we feel that that's kind of wasted effort at this point and we just want to go whole hog into we need a legislative solution?
Well, my reaction would be, I think if we need to take some steps in the interim to do that, while we're also raising the question of the long term, we have to do it simultaneously.
Yeah. So if that's the case, I would personally like to ask the RPT staff if we could get, kind of a comparison of the 1% intervals between that 10 and 15, just to be able to gauge that. I don't know if being down 32% really does it for VRE. And it seems like enough agencies are doing well with that 10% floor. Maybe there is some additional room to nudge it a little bit.
Yeah, my comments are, the floor just doesn't do it for me. I just don't like, I think it takes out performance. I would say another, and this is just based on what I've heard from VRE, this problem is not going to be fixed by 24. It's not going to be fixed by 25. I think we're at 2026 before they really think they'll get to, and if that's the wrong number, please correct me. But if we go for a floor, are we doing it for 25 and 26 because they're going to need it? So that's my only concern based on what they projected. we're gonna still be in the same spot with them. So is it performance-based and you make adjustments, or is it performance-based and you have some other piece that Kate referenced? But I just am not, with their projections of numbers today, I'm a little concerned about a floor, because we're gonna ask you for a floor for the next, at least one more cycle, for them, and unless they get a legislative fix, which at this point, I mean, for this group, that's not gonna happen in the next 2 years. So we'll still be in that legislative fix 2 years now. So, or maybe we're not, maybe y'all are optimistic, but.
So if I could, Mr. Chair, I'll offer this from the staff perspective. Like I hear you and I agree that sticking with the spirit of the performance-based formula, particularly with this administration, is going to be important. So I think what we can do is go back and look at some other solutions, because I also don't think it's palatable to come out of TSDAC and just say, hey, we need the legislation to change. We need General Assembly to do something and throw our hands up. I don't think that's fair either. So I think maybe we've been looking at this from a formula perspective. Let us go back and think about some other approaches to, I keep calling it the COVID disentanglement, but there is a COVID disentanglement. That's what we're trying to do. And let's stop talking about it in terms of the formula and see what we can do to help VRE. Because again, the Commonwealth is has a vested interest in seeing VRE be successful. Like, the last thing that I want to do is do something that is detrimental to a partner on a huge economic initiative like transforming rail in Virginia. And so, like, I think we can go back and come up with some things non-formula, hearing that what I'm hearing is that formula-wise, we're content with what we have. Let us take a step and go outside the formula and see what kinds of solutions we think might work with that, and also consult with VPRA.
And if I may, Jen, this may not be the way you should approach this, and obviously your staff will come back to that, but the formula, I feel like, is working. You just said that. But even if we just said, hey, VRE, and this is probably way too simple for what somebody may tolerate, we will just give you your FY19 information, and we'll plug that in for the next 2 years, and you've got to figure it out after that. Like, make it not normal for everybody else, but just make it simple for them. Get them harmless by saying, we did get you for performance, but when you were able to perform, but after that, good luck to you. Like,
So that's a great example. I mean, I think we went from one place to another really quickly, and I'm like, I find myself in a very weird place. Y'all just have to acknowledge that. So I think there's some other solutions that we can think about that hopefully can get us to a place where we're comfortable, and then the legislative process can do what it's going to do. I can't speak to that. I don't know what the position of the administration is going to be on anything specific to VRE, and I just, like, I think that is beyond the scope of this body, but to acknowledge that something needs to be done to address that because of the value that VRE provides to the Commonwealth is something this body has long acknowledged. And so I think we have some more work to do and come back in July with some other options before we put the operating element.
If I could. Let's speak to your point of, we don't know what the administration is. I think in that situation, you have a scenario you can sit back and try to figure out, wait for them to decide what they're going to do, and then comment. Or you can try to suggest to them where you think they ought to go to help set the parameters of the discussion, so that perhaps they will take that into consideration and move in that direction. And I'm always a firm believer of, when to determine the outcome of the debate, you set the parameters of the debate beforehand, as opposed to sitting back and letting somebody oppose it on you. So I just assume share with them our ideas, and either they can take them or not. But it's clear that if we don't give them anything, they're not going to.
And that's not what I'm suggesting.
No, I know.
That's not what I'm suggesting.
I understand exactly what my view is. If we've got something to say, we need to kind of throw it over the transom, at least make sure it's in the mix when they decide what they want to do.
I don't disagree with you. I think there's more work for us to do before we're ready to.
Totally, whatever that result of that work is.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman,
Dr. Smoot?
I'm also uncomfortable with what Jennifer just laid out for us. And, you know, I think one thing we need to keep in the back of our mind is that the Long Bridge project, which was years in the making, and it involves multiple funders, should not be jeopardized with a belief that VRE is going to be diminished, and therefore there's not going to be a need in the future for as many crossings of the Potomac. That is a very long-range view that I think we have to continue to hold before us, because it is important to all north-south rail traffic in the Commonwealth, not just VRE, not just Northern Virginia, but anything going north and south has to cross the Long Bridge. And I would not want to inadvertently send a message that suggests that we think that project will be less important in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Smoot.
Cindy Messer, did you have anything you wanted to add conversation?
Thank you, Chair. It's finally quiet here. I was actually sending Kate a message to read for me because the background noise was too loud. But thank you for the opportunity. I agree with the points about VRE and future legislative approach. And in the near term, I concur with what Jen laid out for DRPT to go back and look at some other options, because I do want to maintain performance in the formula. I appreciate, again, the scenarios looking at the floor on operating to see if it did an impact, but some percentage shifts in between might be useful to look at, but I think probably we need another solution. So I appreciate DRPT's willingness to go back and look at that. And also I appreciate where we're landing, because even if we didn't kind of go down that approach, I wasn't sure I'd be ready for a vote on all this good data that Dan just shared. So I appreciate that we can look at the July meeting and revisit this holistically. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else have any comments about it?
And thank you, staff, for all of your hard work, because I know it was a lot, and to have this discussion and end up where we are would probably be a little frustrating. But thank you for your work. And I will say, putting these meetings on a regular schedule was a great idea in the beginning, but man, they come fast. As soon as you guys leave here today, it's like the countdown clock is already going for the next meeting.
Those of us in local government understand.
Yeah. Like CTV and this are like, back and forth.
Indeed.
I just need to put in a request, because given the date of our next meeting, I'm going to be 7 grandkids in North Carolina, so I need to probably call in.
Actually, we were going to make a recommendation that we move the next meeting out a week, which would move it to the 15th. July 15th, and then that gets it away from your commission meeting, Kate, because I think that's the night before. The I-81 commission meets the day before. There's a lot of conflicts that are popping up around that time, and so it would be helpful to us, and it would give us another week, if that's acceptable.
The only note that is the VRE Operations Board meeting day, so that's not the end of the world.
Okay.
But interesting timing, let's just say, considering what we spent a majority of this evening or this morning talking about.
That would be very helpful. As much as I'd love to see what it'd be like to sit in on this meeting with 7 grandkids running around.
Well, and I will, since you're talking about your grandkids, I will also say that is end of season long course swim meet for my son that moved from Stafford to Christiansburg, and I found that out yesterday. So I can put him in a car with somebody else and send him to Stafford, go into Christiansburg a little bit.
How long is it to take you along? So you
No, so
What? Said any votes for the 22nd?
well,
Sorry, it gets worse. I know.
I mean,
Yeah, I think the other thing that, you know, we'll run some other, I don't want to call them scenarios because we're going to step away from the formula. We'll look at some other options and speak with the secretary between now and then as well. I think that gets us on a trajectory to get things wrapped up and get to the Commonwealth Transportation Board in September like we had planned.
Do you have a favor to ask when you prepare the agendas? If we have an action, can you actually note that we're taking action?
Okay.
I saw discussion, and I did not know we were taking action today.
On the first two items?
Yeah,
Sure.
it just helps.
Sure.
Thank you.
I think it was uncertain in what we were going to do.
Okay, it's helpful, especially for those of us who are convening the opinions of a lot of people ahead of time.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess in that sense, I was just sort of interpreting the fact that we pretty much had full discussion of those items beforehand. We wanted to just put a period
No,
on
it's
it.
just that, you know, if we do anticipate action, it's helpful.
Sure.
Because we're, yeah.
And so are you officially telling us we're moving to the 15th, is that correct?
If y'all are agreeable, that would be much, but I will be in, I could go to Dr. Smoot's house and do the meeting remotely, so we have to have it on the 8th.
Come on down.
There's something
Hey,
back in my
Chair.
mind as the 15th. I'm not sure, but I'll let you talk.
Yeah, we will say we are going to move it from the 8th, and we're looking at the 15th, but if you want to,
I'll let you know later today.
okay. We'll send out a confirmation. I think
Yeah.
that's to be said. But we'll update the calendar invite and let everybody know when we get the meeting summary
Okay.
and follow up out.
And Chair, if I could note, the 15th would work for me. I also could do the 22nd, but then we're pushing to the August, and hopefully we can have the majority of us there because this is, if not 100%, because it's such an important concept, including the chair to be there, so I defer to your calendar.
So Kate's asking, is there an August meeting?
Yeah, if there is an August meeting, I maybe like you, maybe not with grandkids, but with kids at Doc.
So I think, I mean, we're getting dangerously close to kind of the end, and I think if we can use July, I'll be here in person, then I think we're probably pretty close to done. And we can do something, if we needed to do something in August, it would be literally just to put a bow on it and be done. I'm also on vacation in August, be out of the country. So
In August.
I'm out the 15th through the 26th, something like that, of August. I'm out of the country, so I'm not calling it.
Dial in, international call for TSDAC.
Yeah, I'm sure the agency would love that phone bill. The 5-hour time difference would be lovely.
We do have one scheduled.
We do have one on the calendar for August. I think you're on the calendar through the end of the year, so. I will give you your Friday mornings back at some point. So I think we'll circle back, but July 8th, we're not going to do July 8th because
Right.
there's too many of us that would be at alternate locations.
Okay.
So we'll finalize the date. Anything else you guys have for next?
So, I guess I would ask this. Do we want to, before we go to the wrap up and next steps, do we want to go ahead to public comment?
I think I know we have several folks that are interested in public comment.
And do we have anything else before we move away from this? Anything else we want to say? No staff. We have comments after the public comment. All right.
Okay, so just making sure that the folks online can hear us. Mary Olivia is a little further away from the mic. If you are joining us remotely and want to make a comment, you can use the raised hand feature in the GoToWebinar or drop
drop a message to Mary Olivia in the chat, and we'll, Joe Schwartz, DRE.
Good morning.
Good morning. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself to.
Sure. So my name's Joe Schwartz. I'm from the Virginia Railway Express. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to provide comment. I had a sort of written bullet points that I was going to speak to, and then the conversation covered some of them and then went in a direction I wasn't expecting. So let me wing this a little bit. First off, I have no direction from my board at this point to talk about any sort of legislative fix to the way or change the way that we get operating assistance. But if that were to happen in the future, I think it would be very helpful if TSDAC and CTB and others had made a statement that said, look, it's just become hard, as somebody said, to shoehorn BRE into the way that we do it with the other systems. So I think we would welcome that. And then there has been discussion, or at least brought up a few times, about some sort of hold harmless scenario, which I think is something that ought to be looked at. I mean, in particular, given that there is $14 million more in the operating funding available in 2014 over the baseline, you would be able to keep everybody at the baseline level, and then agencies that that perform in the formula could still share in that additional $14 million. So I would urge staff, if they can put something together like that, to show that to the board and see how that affects all of the agencies in the state. So at that point, you've sort of covered a lot of the things that I was going to talk about. So I will leave it at that, and I thank you all for letting me comment.
Thank you very much, Joe. Do you have anybody else?
Olivia. Do we have anybody else? Penny
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to comment on the operating assistance program. Thank you to the work of the committee and also the staff of DRPT. I know this has been a lot of work. And like Joe, a number of the questions and comments I have been addressed during the conversation, but I will reiterate some of those concerns from the Loudoun County perspective. And by the way, I'm Penny Newquist, Assistant Director for Transportation Services in Loudoun County's Department of Transportation Capital Infrastructure.
Thank you.
I'm not asking the committee to alter the formula utilized under the merit program. As Ms. DeBrule stated, the formula is working as planned. However, the extreme impacts of COVID-19 on transit were never anticipated when the merit program was created. The impacts continue to be felt throughout the industry. Loudoun County is concerned about the scenarios presented that result in reductions of operating assistance of possibly 34%, or a loss of $1.2 to $1.5 million, when we usually receive a $4 million payment every year. The Loudoun County Board of Supervisors has made a significant investment and has directed staff to make every effort to fully utilize the Silver Line Metro Rail system. We have already prepared the addition of 20 more new transit routes to get riders to the new Metro Rail system when it opens, hopefully sometime this year. Loss of over $1 million or more in state operating assistance comes at a time when we are increasing service, not decreasing. While FY21 may be the closest measure of transit activity for the purposes of merit, Loudoun is now being negatively impacted as we have been right-sizing our operations to correspond with the number of riders, and we modify that the number of buses on the routes based on ridership and the demand that existed for traveling public during COVID-19. We are also seeing an upward tick in all of our systems with regard to ridership demand. I will also note that we have reduced our carbon footprint by the right-sizing approach that we've taken with our transit system. I understand the need to use audited numbers, which are fiscal year 21, as the basis for the 24 operating assistance. However, this is a significant lag using 21 at a time when Loudoun's costs will continue to increase significantly as the Metro Rail service begins and as federal employees return to work. I'm asking for consideration of a hold harmless approach for the next 2 years to buffer the impacts of COVID as operations of our transit system begin to level out following the impacts of COVID, return of ridership, and the new ridership expected from the Silver Line Phase 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much. So I think my echo was coming through.
Yeah.
Any response to anything? Pretty much. So I guess that would bring us on to wrap up the next steps.
Yeah, and I think we've already covered next steps in terms of the timing of the next meeting. We'll circle back with everyone on the date for that. Tentatively, I think we've settled on July 15th, but we'll confirm that.
And our next assignment is to go back and set the formula aside and look at some other solutions. There you go. That's a good word. Some other options for consideration and bring those in July. And then TSDAC required to have a public hearing before we wrap things up. So we will have to have a formal public hearing associated with this, and we'll try to get that done at the July meeting as well, so that we can get that completed. We have people that are reading, we go back and read the code and make sure we're following all of them. So that would be something we also need to take care of before we wrap.
Does anybody else have anything that they would like to?
I'm just going to say a big thank you to Dan and the rest of the team. This is just fantastic. Thank you.
Great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Well, thanks to the members of the commission for all your comments and input. I know it'll be valuable for staff to have that reaction.
And we'll have you back.
Stay safe, and thanks for a good meeting.
And Cindy, good luck to you on your presentation today.
Thank you. Perfect timing. I can now go prep without rushing in, so I appreciate that as well.
Yeah.
And Dr. Smith, thank you for being with us today, too. Okay. With that, if no other business, I will adjourn this meeting.
Thanks.